Thank you for joining us for the latest in our GeoTalks Express series. Today, as you're hopefully seeing on the screen, we're going to be talking about some online data. We're going to be exploring Global Mapper's online data access functionality. I am joined this morning by Katrina Schweikert. Good morning, Katrina.
Good morning, David.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to
Glad to
look
hear.
at some online data.
Excellent, excellent. I know we are at the whim of our online services today. More than any other presentation, we are obviously depending on the availability of a reliable internet connection. And right off the bat, it might be worth noting that if we're not able to connect to some of these services, we'll apologize ahead of time. So again, we're using a little bit of bandwidth here for the actual presentation itself. So hopefully, some of these services that we want to show you, hopefully they will be available. Before we get started, the usual housekeeping issues we need to cover. I know most of you have likely been in some of our previous presentations. Those of you who are new, a special welcome for you, but just to let you know how this setup works. You are in listen-only mode. Obviously, you can hear myself, hopefully, and you can hear Katrina. Unfortunately, we can't hear you, but that's fine. If you have any questions that you want to ask of myself or Katrina, or indeed of the functionality that we're going to be sharing with you, please use that questions panel. You should see it over there on the right side of your screen. I have a huge windows in front of me with that display open. So if the questions as they come in, I will see them. In answering those questions, we will read them back to you. So everyone will hear the question, and hopefully we'll be able to provide an answer. Some of the questions we're asked will be a little more involved, and if that's the case, we will answer those offline. We'll take those questions and follow up with you directly if we don't have the time to answer those questions during the presentation itself. We are recording this presentation. The recording will be processed and will be uploaded within a few days. You will receive an email with a link so you can review the presentation. You can maybe share it with your colleagues as well if you would like. Obviously, if you are watching the recording of this presentation a little further down the road, questions are not going to be available, obviously, in real time, but I will provide an email address at the end. It's also in the description right below. If you have questions, you can send an email to our tech crew, and again, we can answer any of those questions for you. Just a quick note about some of the sessions that are coming up. Our GeoTalks Express, this is a monthly series. We're going to continue next month, again, within Global Mapper. We're going to take a look specifically at raster data. Most of the work that we showcase, most of the functionality we showcase involves either working with some vectors or indeed working with terrain. And we tend to relegate raster data kind of to the back seat. Well, we want to bring it front and center and talk a little bit about some of the raster processing tools, some of the very interesting components of the software that allow you not just to visualize raster data, but to analyze raster data. So we'll take a look at some of those tools in our next session coming up May 19th. I'm going to take a kind of a side journey to look at some point cloud data in June 16th. We're going to be looking at some of the tools in the LiDAR module, specifically for improving the quality of point cloud data. I know we focus a lot on some of those analysis tools, those processing tools. We generate our DEMS, we do some feature extraction, but before you get there, looking at the quality of your LiDAR or your point cloud data is an important consideration. And we'll introduce some of those tools during that presentation in June. We're going to work in tandem with a company that has used a Global Mapper extension for our July session, the Datum toolbar. You'll see Global Mapper as a recognizable feature, but there are some additional tools in there that have been added, and we'll show the work that they have done in Global Mapper to kind of integrate their workflow into the Global Mapper interface using Global Mapper's SDK and with an extension built in there. So that we'll focus on in July. There will be additional sessions coming up. We will announce those in due course. Information about the sessions are available, and indeed registration links are available at the website you see on the screen. Also noteworthy, we have training. There's actually a training class, a public class going on this week. That will continue next week with a LiDAR class. There is still some space available in that, so if you are interested in getting some training on the LiDAR module, Tuesday through Thursday of next week, we will be doing that. Katrina, I believe you're going to be participating in that session next week, our class next week.
Some of it, yep.
Yeah, we're going to be involved in that. So myself, Katrina, and one of our colleagues are doing that class. If you're interested in some training, again, there is still space available. In May, we're doing an applied geology class that kind of ties in with Geographic Calculator. Global Mapper, again, we'll be training in June, and once again, LiDAR module a little bit later the following week. So spaces are available for all of these classes if you're interested in some training. And again, more information is available at the website that you see on the screen. So back to today. quick look at our agenda. Now, obviously, our focus today is going to be on online data. Well, we're first going to answer the question, why? Why would you even be paying attention to this? Why is it important? Well, we'll bring up some bullets that outline some of the advantages of accessing data in this format. We'll then introduce you to the component in Global Mapper where you can access this data. And a lot of you have used this already, I know. Those of you who are new, a quick overview of the layout of that component, that dialog box in Global Mapper. Some specifics within that dialog box, defining the extent of what data you want access to. We'll go through a couple of different workflows, a few variations on limiting the extent of the data that's actually displayed on your screen. And that might be something to consider from an efficiency point of view. You don't necessarily need to stream the entire data set. You may want a subset, and we'll show you the options that are available for that. We'll then introduce in that context some of the more commonly used services. We're thinking the imagery data sets, which a lot of people access, maybe some terrain data. I'll also introduce OpenStreetMap as a screen service. So again, for most of you who are just interested in a base map, we'll take a look at what's available, not only within the context of the US, which is where we're located, but also worldwide. We have a number of worldwide data sets as well. Katrina's going to share some workflows about getting your own sources in there as well, your own services, maybe something that's not pre-configured in the application, something that you have access to locally. We'll show how you can enhance the list of services available in the application by adding your own. So we'll go through a couple of workflows or a couple of examples of that. And then based on our time available, and we've got a long list, we want to showcase some of what we would consider more special sources. Things like weather services can be imported or rendered on your screen. So we'll take a look at as many of those as we can in the time available. And also worth noting here, and this is a question we get a lot, what about working offline? Yeah, it's great to have these services available when you're connected, but what if you're not connected? What if you're in the field? What if you don't have internet access? What options do you have? And we'll take a look at the workflows involved in being able to access these data sets in an offline situation. We've had a couple of people coming in questioning the audio. Hopefully our audio is coming through. Some people are having audio issues. Hopefully those can be resolved locally. Let's continue. I'm assuming most of you are hearing what we're going through here. The first bullet in my list was why use online data? Well, some of the reasons are obvious. You can access a wide variety of data. When I first started sharing this functionality through training and through presentations, long time ago, it was a fairly kind of novel concept to be able to access data from a remote location. Fast forward to today, and virtually everything that we consume is consumed online. You think of your movies, your music, the meetings we've all been attending over the last year online. All of these services are now online services. So obviously geospatial data consumption lends itself to this online delivery mechanism. And to that, based on that, there's a lot of services you can access, a wide variety. We're going to showcase some of those today. So this sheer volume of data is a good reason that you will want to be considering this access to data. They're available on demand. As in preparation for this, I was scrolling through some of the services, and it's simply a click of a button. I can get the latest imagery. I can get some really top quality topographic maps, all on demand when I need them, providing base maps for my projects. You don't have to store this data locally. You're accessing it remotely, so there's no storage requirements until it comes to the point where you need to capture that for offline use, but you don't have to store anything locally. And this is probably one of the major advantages. If the data service that you're accessing is updated, maybe new imagery is added to a service, you get that in real time. There's no additional installation required. There's no other additional download required. It will update in real time. Whoever maintains that service will simply update the data that's included in there, and you will get that in real time as noted here. Now, aside from that, we also, within Global Mapper, update the list of services on an ongoing basis. And this is actually something Katrina's involved with, just maintaining that list. This is a fairly unique component of Global Mapper because it doesn't require you to install a new version of the software or even upgrade to the latest version to get that list. You get that in real time as well. So if a service is added, somebody makes a suggestion, for instance, that you should probably add this particular service, we can do that today. It will be available to you today in your version of Global Mapper. No installation needed, no download download needed. Katrina's maybe going to share a little bit more about that process, and indeed we're going to encourage you, if you ever do encounter a service that you think would be valuable to the kind of community at large, let us know. We can add that and update the list in real time. So again, the services are continually being updated. The display of the data is optimized as well. You'll see when we actually get in looking at the way that we access this data, it's scaled. Scaled dynamically. If I'm looking at a wide area, I get a view of that data that's appropriate, zoom into a smaller region, larger scale, and I get a resolution that's appropriate. So it automatically scales to whatever visible area that I'm looking at. And as I mentioned before, it is exportable. For the most part, there are going to be certain limitations, and we'll take a look at how you can find out what those are. We often get questions about copyright issues. Can I use this data in my project? Can I publish this map? Not something that we have control over, we being Blue Marble Geographics, but certainly you can access the data provider and find out what limitations there may be. But you can, for the most part, export these data sets. Now, it's a little bit of a kind of a disconcerting start when we begin with a disclaimer, but this is something we need to share. Today, we're going to be working with online data, and there is, as I said at the start, no guarantee that all the services that we would like to show you are necessarily going to be available. There are ongoing issues, as I'm sure many of you encountered. Now, that's applicable today as we begin to explore some of these services and share them with you, but also as an ongoing issue. There is no guarantee that a particular service that you accessed yesterday will be available when you're sitting in the conference room giving that presentation tomorrow. It might not be available. That may be down for a lot of reasons. Server may maybe have reached its usage capacity. They may have taken it down for maintenance. There's all sorts of possible reasons. As you see at the bottom, Blue Marble, we have no control over that process. So we do get a lot of issues coming into our tech support team questioning that. Again, this is not something that we can control. We provide access to these sources of data, but really the maintenance and ongoing availability is really out of our hands. So that, by way of disclaimer, just so you're aware that it's not a guarantee that you'll have access to that data. So the first bullet in my list was, or the second bullet after addressing the question of why, is a quick introduction to the portal itself. Now I'm going to bring up an instance of Global Mapper, and I should tell you, I have several instances of Global Mapper running in the background. In case one of the services I try to access is not responding, I can quickly bring up another instance and we can continue to look at another one. But before we get to some specifics, it is worth introducing this component. Now you can access this from a number of locations. Those of you who have used Global Mapper will be familiar. Right here in the middle of the introductory screen, we have the online data sources. We can also access it using this little globe button in the toolbar, or indeed from the file menu, we have that as well. So either of these options will bring up the dialog box that shows you the access point. I call this a portal, the portal to get to your online data. Now, Katrina, maybe you could talk a little bit about how this data is organized, given that this is something that you do on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a number of built-in sources. If you want to scroll up to the top, we've sort of put some of the most important ones at the top just by using the stars. So popular sources are things that a lot of people are going to go to frequently, like imagery, elevation data, base map data. And then zooming down a little bit, we have, as David mentioned, some premium sources that do require an additional subscription or purchase to access. And then a number of categories, so things like aviation data, environmental data, weather. We'll take a look at a lot of these throughout this presentation. Different categories here. And then at the bottom, again, worldwide data. So no matter where you are, you can access this worldwide data that is global coverage. And there's some overlap between categories. There are things that show up in more than one category, or maybe that could be in more than one category. Obviously the NASA satellite data is global coverage, but we've just made it a separate category since it is a bit specialized.
Yeah, these lists are not mutually exclusive. There is worldwide data that's also imagery. It's worth noting. Yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps worth noting also under country data and under US data, there are a number of subfolders that you can take a look at to drill into a specific area. So for the US, we have some state sources built in. And for country data, we have a number of countries that we've added. And again, we are continually adding to this list and trying to keep it updated.
Yeah, and again, we're going to say this a lot during today. If you have access to a service, or you're aware of a service that's not included in here, you can add it yourself. But Katrina's going to show us a little bit later how to do that. But please let us know, and we can again add those non-listed sources so that everyone can access them. Also, before we get into any specifics, it is worth noting in this dialog box some of the options you have to constrain the extent of what's loaded. And you'll see these all listed at the bottom here. Now, obviously, in this example, or this scenario, I've loaded the dialog box without any pre-existing data on my screen. I don't have any reference data. I'm not working on a project area, so there's no existing geographic extent that I would be limiting my data to. So you'll notice here the option for current screen bounds isn't even available because there is no geographic area. But I can, at this stage, if I want, define a more specific area to access that data within a certain distance of a known address. This is a geocoding function, by the way. This will go out and determine the lat long based on the address parameters you put in here within a certain distance of a latitude, known latitude and longitude. I'm not going to demonstrate these. I had some notes in front of me to actually show these, but it's very intuitive, very obvious how that works. You can specify the actual north, south, east, and west latitude and longitude bounds if you want something more specific. You can derive the extent by a polygon. I'm actually going to show this in a few minutes. This is a very useful tool. And indeed, it's a component that you will find in many areas of Global Mapper to limit the extent of whatever process you're embarking on, whether it be contour generation or exporting, or indeed, in this case, streaming data. You can constrain that to a polygon. The example that's accepted, assigned by default in this example, because I don't have any data, is the entire data source bounds. And you always have that option. You can stream the entire data. Now, that might seem like a lot of data, but don't worry. Again, it's going to be scaled and rendered based on your resolution. So to show you a quick first example of this, and to kind of tie this into a presentation we did just a few weeks ago, we did a presentation on bathymetry. One of the data services we showcased there was this general bathymetric chart of the ocean, just so kind of to provide a good segue. We'll take a look at that data without any predetermined extent. And again, we're hoping this actually works, and it looks like it did. We now have that data. Now, again, to full extent, you'll see that loaded fairly quickly. There was obviously, no time lag there, and the resolution of this data is obviously very relevant for the extent of my map. Now, I'm not sure how realistic this is. I could at this stage zoom into a closer area, and indeed a lot of folks are using that process to determine, okay, where am I in the world? Now I see where I am in the world, I can zoom in. And if I zoomed, I would get a higher resolution return every time. I'm going to unload this data. I'm going to do something that's perhaps a little more meaningful. I'm going to bring in a file. I think it should be in my recents list now. Those of you who are geographically astute may recognize this as the boundary of the country of Switzerland. Let's assume we're doing a project in this extent. Now we have defined a geographic extent for my screen. I can go into the dialog box again, and I can do one of two things. I can either just simply load the screen bounds as before. We'll use the same service as before. I know that technically it's bathymetric data, but it also has some terrestrial data as well. You'll notice now current screen bounds is the default. So it will load the extent of my screen. Now, I also want to point out another option that is appropriate, where you can restrict the source just to those bounds. In other words, it will not let you pan. It can be a little frustrating sometimes when you realize, oh, I need to move slightly to the east or west. Oh, I got to reconnect to the service because I had restricted the bound. So you have that option, but it's not enabled by default. So again, I'll just go with my screen bounds here, connect once again. I'll get a slightly more close-up, slightly higher resolution rendering of that data. Again, assuming it cooperates. I hope it does. It did earlier today. You can see my little spinning wheel here. Hopefully it will pop into place. I'll give it another few seconds, and if not, I will abort and bring up, as I said, another instance of Global Mapper. Let's go ahead and do
One
that.
question that has come in, David,
Sure.
is about the address search. So they're asking if it is just the US or if it's everywhere for that address search.
Yeah, it is a global. It's the address search is similar to our geocoding tool, and the search basically uses the same address search functionality you'll see in Google Maps, for instance. It's a Google's API. So if you type in an address to search for something in Google Maps, it's going to return a lat long to show you where that address is or that restaurant is or whatever. We're using the same process. So it is global. It is global, and it does allow you a little flexibility in terms of what address components. It doesn't have to be a structured address. If you simply know the postal code, it will center you on that postal code. And I'll show you again when we get into the dialog box. You can define the extent. That extent is actually not a circular extent, it's not a radius, but rather it's a box that's constrained by that point. Again, I'll show you that in just a second. Before I get there, I just want to check to my, it finally came in here. So here you can see just for the geographic extent of the data that there I'd loaded. Here we have a nice view of the Alps right here. So again, limited to the extent or geographic boundary of my area of interest. Just to do a quick example, and again, I'm at the whim of the available service here, but if I have selected a polygon, which I've done in this case, we can go back into the portal once again, or into the dialog box, choosing the same service again, and again, entire data source bounds, no, I'm sorry, within the selected polygon is a relevant workflow now, because I can limit the data just to the boundary of that country or whatever your project is, the extent of your project. The question before about the address, again, whatever component of an address you can put in here, and this range is a north, south, east, west range as opposed to a radius. So that's basically what that will do, and it allows you to load data obviously without having any initial geographic reference. So I'll just try this one again. We'll see if it cooperates any better here. Obviously, there we go. We've got a nice map now contained within the boundary of the country of Switzerland. So number of ways of constraining the data for limiting extent, again, coordinates, polygon, or a known address, or indeed, if you want, you can absolutely load the full extent. Now, one of the bullets I had at the start of the list is to look at some of those common sources. For most people going into this portal, they're interested in a base map. They want a geographic frame of reference for maybe some work they're doing in the digitizer or with some point cloud data. They simply need to have that frame of reference. And I'm going to showcase, here we obviously in the country of Switzerland, I'm going to showcase some of the services that would be applicable for this geographic area. And I'm not looking at any detailed area here. Obviously, I'm looking at a countrywide extent. So quickly focusing on that, and obviously in this case, the worldwide data is a relevant subsection to look in. First thing, if we're looking at for some terrain, you'll notice we have the ASTER terrain, our global digital elevation model, 1 arcsecond resolution. Also have the SRTM. A lot of people are familiar with the Shuttle Radar Topography Mission, I believe is the acronym, 1 arcsecond once again. Again, I'll connect to that. I'm not going to constrain it this time. I'll just connect to that, to my screen bounds, and this will render terrain data. Now, this is a raster streaming service, but this raster data is obviously a gridded layer. This is terrain. You can perform analysis on this terrain just like you could if it was a file, but I would discourage you from trying too much, simply because all of that analysis would be going out to the server to try to determine, for instance, your watersheds or your contours. So while you can, it's probably a better idea to capture this as a local file. And a little bit later, we'll talk about that process. But we have access to these terrain data sets, again, here at a global scale, this SRTM data, and you can apply a different shader. I think more appropriate would be a global shader in this case. There's a nice rendering, once again, of the Alps. Now, you can keep that service active. I now have a couple of services active. Let's look at some global imagery. We also have a world data set for imagery. Right here under worldwide data, we can connect to that. And again, brings in a snapshot of our world imagery. Again, appropriate resolution for the extent of my screen. I'm not going to zoom any further, but if I did, it would continually resample that data and give me a resolution that's appropriate for that extent. I also want to show another worldwide data set before we shift our focus a little bit to looking at some US sources, and that is the OpenStreetMap. Those of you who are not familiar with OpenStreetMap, there is it's a great website, osm.org. You can go there and find out all about that project. It is a collaborative worldwide project to create the foremost road, street, point of interest database available anywhere, the foremost map basically, and we can stream that data in real time into Global Mapper as well. You'll see right here we have that option under worldwide data. There's a few variations on the theme. If I have time a little bit later, we may take a look at some of those variations, but for now we'll take a look at the standard OpenStreetMap. Again, at this perspective, wide area perspective, we're going to get a kind of a region-wide view of the OpenStreetMap data. It is a rasterized version of that data, so you're seeing the text a little bit blurred here. In this example, I will zoom in just a little bit closer so we can see kind of an up-close view. I'll zoom into Geneva here. First, we've got our imagery, and then our OpenStreetMap data is coming into view as well. Going a little closer, you'll see we're going to start to see some of the individual building components. Here we have our imagery, and again, OpenStreetMap. So that's a phenomenal
And
resource to have at your fingertips, providing access to this high quality
David, perhaps I can
road and
throw
street.
you a loop here. Can we load OpenStreetMap one more time? I want to talk a little bit about the detail level slider. So if you go back to online sources.
Sure, I'm going to just close it for now, and we'll go online once again. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so often with base map data that has labels, it can be a little bit difficult to read some of those. It depends on your screen resolution, your monitor, all sorts of different things as to how that map zoom level gets interpreted. So this slider is actually a way to request more or less detail and sort of offset those zoom levels. So David, if you just slide that a little bit towards less and then we reload that source, maybe not quite that far, just a little bit, we'll see, yeah, that should be good. We should see much more legible text, much bigger data.
Yeah,
So
so
that is an
let's.
option if you want to change that scale and how you're seeing that data.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We're getting a lot of questions coming in, by the way. I'm obviously, with looking at the screen, I'm not able to pay attention. One about the layering hierarchy. Obviously, I've got 3 services here. The rule of thumb is the last service that I add, or indeed the last layer that I add, is always going to be on top. So that is how Global Mapper works. Yes, you can drag them up or down to change the order. So if I want to move the imagery to the top of the list, it will display obviously the imagery. We're dealing with raster data that's opaque. So obviously in this case, we can only see one at a time. This is a little off script, but it's something I was going to show a little bit later, maybe relevant to address that issue. So we have OpenStreetMap and we've got imagery. I can turn the OpenStreetMap on. There's my nice imagery of Geneva. If I wanted to see both at the same time, we do have the our split view 2D map view, where we can add a second view. And now by default, the second view will be an identical view, but we also have the option to change its configuration so that we can look, for instance, in my primary map, maybe I only want to look at, let's clear all, let's look at the, which one, the world imagery in that one. We'll click OK, and maybe my second, again, I'll clear all and just look at my, what are we looking at? OpenStreetMap. So here we have 2 views that can be linked together. So as you zoom in one, the other will follow along. And again, we'll close the dialog box very quickly here. I'm going to dock this over on the side. And we get 2 side-by-side views. Look, my docking isn't working. Here we go. So we've got 2 side-by-side views now. So if I do zoom on one, the other one will follow along. I get identical side-by-sides. Now this split map view obviously is not directly related to online data, but it works very well in this context. You know, having a topographic map, having some imagery, maybe having a terrain layer on one of these maps. So this might be addressing that issue that where you have multiple layers. How do you manage those multiple layers? I'm going to shift my focus very quickly here. Let's go back to this previous edition of Global Mapper. I'm going to unload the first example we showed. I'm not going to save anything here. This is a good kind of indication, by the way. Those of you familiar with Global Mapper's file management tools, the idea of saving a workspace. A workspace allows you to save a map configuration, any layers that you've loaded, any stylization you've applied, any visualization, etc., can be saved in a file, a workspace file. That file will also save your online sources. It will save the access to that source. So if you load the workspace, it will go back out and pull the data in. So that's one I'm being prompted for here. Do I want to save the workspace? In this case, I'm going to say no. But if this is a project you're working on that you want to continue with tomorrow, perhaps, obviously you'll want to make sure that that connection is retained. Otherwise, you would have to manually load it again. Now, one thing I want to show you as well, we often get questions about the copyright or data metadata for a given layer, and this is a little bit hidden, but if you're in the online data sources dialog box here, you can select any of these sources and right click, and it will allow you to display the web page, the corresponding web page for that service, in which you can see if there are any terms of service. So I've chosen the bathymetric chart of the ocean once again. It's going to pop up my browser here in just a second. Hopefully my Chrome browser should pop into view, and it will display that web page. So I now can access relevant information about that specific service to find out if there are any restrictions in terms of how I use it, or if I want to publish some of the data from there, you can obviously read into that information right here. So that direct access is available right within this portal. Now, once again, I'm going to give my data a little bit of a geographic context by loading up a workspace, and this time I'm moving over to the US. Those of you, again, who are familiar with the state layout of the United States may recognize the state of Massachusetts, just a little further south from where I'm sitting today. And for US users, we have a lot of data sets, US government hosted data sets, USGS, Department of Agriculture, all of these data sets are available for streaming. I'll take a look at a couple of examples of those as well. Once again, just for the purpose of kind of putting this in an appropriate context, I'm going to first of all select the extent. Now, the state of Massachusetts, as you can see, has got some outlying features. By constraining my data to these multiple polygons, again, it limits that data display to those boundaries. Going into the US data section, as you'll see right here, at the high level, we have a number of these data sets available, land cover data, and we may have a chance to look at that a little bit later. The NAIP imagery is available. Katrina mentioned a few premium content sources. I was going to bring this up at the end. The theme of this presentation today is free data. A lot of the data, most of the data we're consuming today is available for free. There was no purchase required, but there are premium content options available. If I was to choose one of these premium content options, there would be a dialog box that would require me to enter whatever subscription number I have or account number in order to access this. And that's an example. The US land parcel data is a premium content option. For this, I'm going to load up the national map imagery. Now, this is again a data set that's been continually updated, 1 foot or better resolution, as you can see right here. We will once again limit it to the extent of my polygons and click connect. And just to get a view of a data source that's available for folks in the US, you'll see it's in my control center already, so it should be following along visually in just a second, hopefully.
So we did have a question about premium content. So in addition to entering your subscription information, if you click on one of those sources, you can also find out information about how to purchase. There is usually a website link that will take you to that purchase site. Most of those are purchased through a partner of ours, not subscriptions that we sell directly.
Right, exactly. So but it is definitely an option. Again, with apologies, we are, obviously dependent on the availability of these services. I'll come back and visit that one in just a second. But just while we're talking about the US, I'm not going to go any further with loading these, but just to point out, there is terrain data. And if I go to the terrain data section, actually, you'll see for the US, we have the NED. Now, this is a little bit old school. This is 10-meter resolution. This is the USGS data set. We use this a lot internally. It's a very low resolution data set, but it works for a lot of kind of regional terrain procedures. We also have the newer 3DEP data as a streaming service, 3D elevation program data as well. Again, with apologies, some of these services are a little uncooperative today, but similar to the terrain data we loaded for Switzerland, we also have access to similar data for the US. So just again, focusing just at the start here on a few of the commonly used services, terrain data, imagery data, and definitely OpenStreetMap is something you'll want to be taking a look at. Time permitting, we'll take another look at some of those a little bit later. But before we get there, it is worth noting we also can add some custom sources. Now, Katrina, I'm going to share or I'll have you share your screen, so maybe you can walk through the process of adding those custom services. I think we have lost audio, Katrina. I think we're not hearing you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yeah.
I apologize, I was muted.
It happens.
So I've clicked on the Add New Sources button just to talk about what we have for available sources here. So we can request access to a number of different web feature services. So you'll see the standard OGC services are things like WMS, WMTS, WFS, WCS. And so those are all here. And then there's some base tile services. This is where you'd be pointing to the tile endpoints. So you might have, a tile-based map. So those are options for doing that, and those have slightly different order of how the tiles are named based on the type of service here. And then we also have the Esri RESTful feature services. So this is going to be downloading vector data directly from a REST feature server or map server. So before we get into one of these, let's take a look a little bit at how you might find some of this data. So for example, here I have a website up for the European Environmental Agency, and I've just, through a web search, found my way to this list of public map services. And if I scroll down here, you'll see there's a number of links for their different servers. So you might have direct access to a server like this. You might also have some sort of a geo portal or a map viewer that lets you see information about the data. But we want to get to the services address one way or another. So first I'm going to take a look at some of this data, and this is actually from the AIR link here. So I've navigated in, so this is a REST server directory, and I can actually navigate through the different folders here to find data that I might be interested in using this interface if you want to. Like I said, they often also have a more visual interface if you prefer looking at data that way. So what I'm looking at here is air emissions for Europe. So this is a data source that has a number of different sublayers here. And looking at this REST interface, right along the top, you'll see the available options here. And some of the easiest sources, I think, to add are these WMS or WMTS sources. So if I just click on this WMS link here, I'm going to get brought directly to the get capabilities request. So that's what we're looking for any of these OGC services like WMS, WMTS. We always want this URL that has the get capabilities built into it. So I'm going to go back to Global Mapper here. And this is a web mapping service. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in this new URL. And actually, when we start, we can clear out the second line here and just have WMS listed here. Actually, I think my copy did not quite work. Let's try that one more time. That is a different service that we'll take a look at later. So we want to start by clicking the Get List of Available Data Layers. And this is going to list out what is available. Some servers only have one layer in it. This one happens to have quite a lot of different data. I'm just going to load one of these. I could actually select this top level and add them all if I wanted to look at all these different layers. Just for the sake of time here, we're just going to look at this one. You can choose either this sort of top level, or this one only has one map style associated with it. Sometimes there are multiple different display renderings or styles that are linked to the map. So either option here is fine. I can either click here or here and then click OK to connect to, this is CO2 emissions for international shipping. So now I have the option of placing this where I want to in my data source. So if I don't select a category here, it'll just go at the bottom of the list, kind of at the top level here, or I could choose one of these existing folders, or I could add my own category. Let's just make a category here for the sake of this and call it custom sources. So you can see what that looks like. That's going to go in alphabetically into the list of data. So we'll go ahead and add that. So now we can test out this source. So this is now built in as a custom source. I could connect to it. That's probably the first thing I want to do. So this is fairly low resolution data. We're just going to request the entire data set bounds and see if we can obtain this data. And actually, I like to open my sample data here just so you can see the context. So sometimes you're going to have options for the projection that we chose for this data. And in this case, it looks like we're in a fairly standard just geographic projection here. When I go and add that source, let's do that one more time. It's going to remember what's selected here. Let's talk about a few of these drop downs. So some of these sources are going to give you options for different projections. This one doesn't really have any localized projections, but some of the smaller scale services will have a more specific projection that might be what you want to request for the data. We also have the available image formats that we can request if it is an image service. For the most part, you can leave this at automatic. If you are trying to request terrain data and you want to try to get it to load as a grid layer, if it is supported, I would recommend requesting it as a TIFF. That's the best way to get it to load as elevation data within Global Mapper. But for most of the other services, you can just stick with automatic and get that, kind of the default data format for that server. So those are additional options if you want to kind of narrow down specifically what you're requesting. So that's a WMS service. Let's go back to my web browser here. Take a look
Katrina,
at one
while
more.
you're doing that, sorry, there was a question came in about the various acronyms, Web Map Service, WCS, etc. Someone asked where you can find what they mean, basically. Well, I did reference the help system in my response, but maybe Web Map Services, raster, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on those or on some of the ones that you're going to be using.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so let's go back to the list here. So for the most part, the names are listed here, and any of those web services, like the bottom 4 here, these are all OGC standardized formats. So there's a lot of information available out there about them. These are often on those Esri REST servers or also on Geo servers that are sharing these services. And so they have standard ways that you query them, like that get capabilities request. So WMS and WMTS are both raster tile data. WMTS is a little bit faster, so if you have the option for that, that usually will load a little bit faster, but they're quite similar. And those are probably the most common web services that you'll find out there. Web feature service is a vector format, so this is actually going to download a GML file and give you the option to save that GML file when you request it. So that's another way to try and get vector data off of a server. So if a server does have it, you'll see that listed as an option along that top bar if it is that Esri REST interface, the option to go to that WFS URL. Web coverage service is, I think it's usually raster data. It actually brings up an interface, and maybe we'll have an example of this in a minute, that gives you some options for the format that you're downloading. It also sometimes is time enabled, where you can request data for a particular timestamp. It sort of depends on how the server was set up in terms of what options are available there, but it does have some additional drop downs that give you options as to exactly what you're requesting for data. And then, as I said, the next 3 going up here, these are all web map tiles, so base map tiles, and you're pointing to the tile endpoint, so you'll actually be going all the way down to the URL for a specific tile. So you can build that with variables. And then the REST feature service is vector data as well. So let's look at some other examples here. So you may also find data in this type of some kind of a catalog here that lets you see a little bit more information about the data. So in this case, you want to find the GeoService URL or the API URL, and you can go ahead and copy that, and we'll look at that in a web browser. So again, this one is also a REST server. And at the top, you'll see we have options for WMS and WCS. So this one we could do as WCS, just for a little bit of a different example here. So I'm going to open that up, and I want to copy this URL here. Let's go back to Global Mapper, and I'm going to add a web coverage service. Enter my URL here, and again, I don't really need to duplicate this. So it's going to parse out the URL and pull out this information after the WCS and fill it in on the second line when I hit this get list of available data layers. So this is the EUDEM layer. This is a kind of cartographic representation of terrain, so it's not a terrain layer that we can analyze, but it is a nice cartographic visual. So we're going to add this as a web coverage service. So again, if there were options here, we would see some additional projection or image format options. Since this is a WCS, we're actually going to be able to specify that once we connect to it. So this one I'll just put at the top level, not in a category, just so you can see what that looks like. Sometimes when I'm adding sources, I just do this. I find them convenient to get to at the bottom of the list here. So let's go ahead and connect to this one. So this one actually has some additional options in terms of the file format that we're requesting, the coordinate reference system. Some of the web coverage services do actually have a timestamp that you can enter. They might have data from multiple dates. And we'll go ahead and request this. And actually, this is pretty big data. I'm gonna actually request a smaller area here. Let's go within 10 miles of Paris. Just to request a little bit smaller of a data set here. So we'll stick with the defaults here. And this is one that you can go ahead and save. So you're just going to enter a name for that location, and it's going to request that data from the server. So hopefully this will just take a minute to download, and we can go ahead and zoom in. So this is actually downloading that base data. So this is a web coverage service again. So it gave us a few different options as to how we want to request the data at the time that we go and request it. So let's turn off our earlier data here and zoom into this layer. So smaller area, and this is being reprojected, so it's a little bit warped. It's a little different projection than my default geographic here. But you can see that cartographic terrain model here. This is the UDEM data. Let's do one more example here. So here I'm looking at, so California actually is some data that was updated yesterday. As David was saying, we do try to update our service on a regular basis. And so here's the Department of Conservation website for California. And if I zoom down here, you'll see here's a list of available services here. So one that we have not built in, but maybe you in particular might be interested in, here is a map service for the oil and gas wells in California. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that map service. So this is actually an Esri REST feature service, and this is at the kind of base level of pointing directly to a specific layer. If I take a look at the URL here, I can actually back up and look at the larger server. You'll see this is what things looked like before, but I was looking at a particular layer. So I have that open again in the next tab here. So I can point to either the server and see all these available layers, or I can point to a specific layer for this REST service. Let's go ahead and point right to this REST server, and we don't want Europe data anymore. This is California, so let's use a new workspace here. So I'm going to add a new source again. This is a RESTful feature service. So the URL that I copied here is a layer, specific layer URL, so we can just connect to it directly. If I went and got rid of this layer designation, which is layer 0, it would be a service and we could request. Actually, let's go ahead and do that. Let's see everything on the server here, just for the heck of it. So you'll see a few options here. I'm going to choose that layer 0 well layer. So this is well data for California. And I might want to rename this just so I remember what it is. Again, I could put it in a new folder if I wanted to put it in my custom sources folder that I added, or one of the other built-in folders. Or if I want to add my own folder here, we'll just put it at the top level here. And let's go ahead and connect to this. This is also downloading vector data, and this is hundreds of thousands of points. And just since we are streaming here, let's just do a small area. We'll do within 10 miles of San Diego, California. So this is gonna, again, download vector data directly from the server. So you wanna be a little bit careful with those REST features to make sure that you're not requesting too big of data, but you can always cancel the request. So this is actually vector points now. This has attributes associated with it. I can change the style, and I can treat it just like any other vector data. And it's been downloaded and stored in my temporary data folder. So that's quite a few examples there. So those are going to be built in and saved with my application settings. There's a couple of ways to share that information if you wanted to share it with another user. One option is to save the source to a file. So you can just save individual sources that you've custom added and share them with somebody else. They can add them from a file within the interface. If you've added a bunch of sources and you want to share them with other users, you can actually use from the help menu the export user settings option, and maybe uncheck most of these and just share those custom online sources. So there's an entire list of custom sources that you can add as a group as well if you want to share them that way.
Okay, Kat, thank you. Excellent. So any of those services you have available or you are aware of, you can certainly add them. A lot of questions coming in. Some of them I think we have already addressed. Somebody mentioned about the multiple polygons. I want to show in just a second when I take the screen back that yes, that does work. Somebody had referenced Hawaii. Here I have obviously the state of Massachusetts I was showing earlier. Yes, you can download data that's constrained to multiple polygons concurrently. Other questions, a lot of questions about the layering. Again, this is not unique to our online data, but any raster data. Global Mapper's work control center allows you to adjust the layering hierarchy, so you can move your data up and down as needed. Someone mentioned about a way to download OSM data. Yes, you can. Before we wrap up our session, I want to talk a little bit about the download process and how you can do that. So yeah, hopefully we're addressing those questions ongoing as we go through our program here. We had a number of additional sources that I wanted to talk about. I'm going to showcase a few of these, but I want to point out some that we won't have time to actually show. We'll go back into the dialog box. I'm going to go back up to the high level. Now, we had mentioned a few of these in passing. Things like aviation charts, sectionals. Those of you who are pilots or involved in kind of aeronautical field, you can stream those right into Global Mapper. Your sectional data, again, based on your geographic extent, that is definitely an option. Weather data is available. This is actually very cool. A lot of this data is hosted locally here in the US by NOAA, including the US Weather Mosaic. Now, I'm looking out the window from where I'm sitting right now. There's not a cloud in the sky, so I'm assuming a little further to my south is going to be the same, but we'll try anyway. This is now for the state of Massachusetts. There's some rain coming a little bit later for the folks in Massachusetts, so you don't want to be bringing your umbrella. So this is real time. This is now real-time data that's now rendered. The US Weather Mosaic is now displayed right in here. That's a real-time option, not just updated periodically, but updated continually. There's a few other options in here. Your hazard data, where are your flood hazards, your tornado hazards, those are all data that are served up by NOAA, but are streamable right into Global Mapper. Now, you ask yourself, well, why should I do this? I can get this on my phone or I can get this on my computer. Well, think about this in the context of your project, the work that you're doing. You can now render that data in real time as a backdrop to your project data. So it gives you a little bit more context. Other options I want to show you. This one is very cool as well. For this, I'm going to clean my map off, actually. Let me unload. There is, Katrina had mentioned the availability of timed data sets. And specifically in here, what I want to look at is some of the NASA data, the global imagery browse sources. Now, this is a very, very extensive list. Those of you who are not into atmospheric science may not be familiar with many of these, but what we're going to show here is the collected reflectance. Basically, this is a satellite image of which there are a couple of variations here. I want to select one just as an example, and I want to click connect to that. Now, what happens when I try to connect to that satellite data, it prompts me to enter a date. And I can put whatever date I want. I'm going to go back 1 month here. On March 21st of this year, we're going to take a look at what the atmospheric conditions look like. And we'll zoom in a little closer to where I am right now. Looks like we had a little bit of sun in March. We can check the weather data to see if that actually is the case. So this is real time in terms of the time frame that you apply. Now, I want to show you a very interesting use case for this. I know we may run out of time here in a few minutes, but this is an interesting one. I have a workspace preloaded in which I've actually added several time frames. This goes back to September of last year. Those of you who remember last year, we had a lot of storms and hurricanes coming on shore in the North Atlantic. Here's one right here. Here's another one. This one, I believe, is Sally. I'm not entirely sure, but I think this is Hurricane Sally. Each of these individual frames that I loaded, and all I did was go back into the server and request a different date every time. It allowed me to make a connection over a sequence, each one separated by a day. Now, this gives me an opportunity to show a really cool tool in Global Mapper for animating multiple layers. I've got these 6 days, 7 days loaded. I can now add these to my animation. This is a toolbar that's available in the application. If it's not visible in your setup, you can go into the view menu and enable the display of the animate toolbar. I'm going to add these layers to my animation, and I'm going to play. Now, hopefully this will come through in the shared version of my screen. It might lag just a little bit because, again, we're using a lot of bandwidth. Let me slow it down just a little bit here. But what we're seeing here is a sequential view of the movement of these storms through the North Atlantic. So this is an example, of a timed data set. You plug in whatever time you need, and also the availability of this animation tool to cycle through. And again, the speed of the animation can be controlled right here. So that is a really interesting use case for online data. Again, relevant data. Maybe you're in the insurance business and you want to see, what the conditions were on a particular day when somebody's making a claim. Was there actually a storm there? Well, you can go back and you can see exactly what those conditions were. So very cool example of timed data. Others I want to show you very quickly. And again, we'll go through some of these sections without actually showing the data itself. Let me go up a level here. We have data on land cover, both global, European, and indeed US land cover data. We have geological data as well, really interesting geological maps for various parts of the world. US, we've got US, Canadian, and US, Australian, and UK data. If you know of any other geological data available as an online service, let us know and we'll add that to the list here as well. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show those. You'll have noticed here we have a LiDAR section. Now, LiDAR, as we know, is a point cloud format. If I expand that section, these connections are not direct connections to a stream service, but rather provide an access point for viewing that data. And again, I'm not going to go any further with this, but if you're working in a local project area, let's say you're looking at somewhere in kind of southern Florida, and you want to know if there's any point cloud data to supplement in the map layers on your screen. If you have that data loaded on your screen and you make a connection to the US LiDAR data set, it will take your map view in Global Mapper and superimpose it into the US national map, allowing you to download and browse through the files and download the point cloud data, the LiDAR data that's available for your project area. So this is really a convenience tool to access downloadable data from an online source. It is technically still online data, but it is not streamed. There is another data source that provides that access. And that, again, going back to something I introduced earlier, is the OpenStreetMap. Again, if you have a project area and you want to supplement that with vector features derived from the OpenStreetMap project, you can download that data directly for your project area specifically using this tool. I strongly encourage you to take a look at this one. Again, it will open in your browser, give you a snapshot of your project area in the OpenStreetMap viewer, and there's a big button to export that, and you have vector features right on your map as well. So a few variations on the OpenStreetMap data source that are available. What else do we have on the list? Kat, what is your favorite service? What should I showcase in the few minutes we have left? Putting you on the spot.
You had on the list here the OpenStreetMap watercolor, just to show another example of a nice base map that you might want to use for backdrop to maybe some other data.
Let's go back
so
to
this is
Switzerland.
actually provided by a cartographic firm out of California, but they provide it free for use. It's a very cool base map. They have a few different options here, but I think we'll take a look at the watercolor data.
Yeah. This is kind of the fusion of GIS as a science and cartographic rendering as an art, because this is a beautiful rendering. I'm going to constrain this to the country of Switzerland. Let's assume we're making a map, a display map of Switzerland. I'm going to limit my extent. We're going to choose the OpenStreetMap, of which Kat mentioned there are a few variations here. This is the watercolor view. We'll click connect. And you can see now this artistic rendering. This is based on OpenStreetMap data, and it is a scalable data set. As you can see, we're looking at an appropriate resolution for the full country here. But if I zoom in a little closer, hopefully this will refresh for me. We'll go into Zurich here, and you'll see each time I zoom, it gives me a slightly more detailed version, again, derived from the OpenStreetMap. This is a really nice base map if you're doing some artistic rendering of whatever project, that watercolor rendering of the OpenStreetMap. Again, a few other variations on that theme are available in there. I'm going to point out my personal favorite. Again, we had to bypass a few of the examples we wanted to show, but this one is my personal favorite. The World Topo Map, or actually the Open Topo Map, based on the same underlying data, but supplementing that data with the SRTM data, you get this really beautiful topographic map. Hopefully it will cooperate. Here we go. It's coming into view. Again, we're looking at Zurich here. And this has the look and the feel of a commercial topographic map. I'll zoom in a little closer here so we can start to see some of the detail. Again, we're starting to see the watercolor background, but then that's being replaced with our open topo map. So again, derived from OpenStreetMap in terms of content, but rendered with the SRTM and with the corresponding terrain features. Slightly lower resolution because of my zoom level here. I'm just going to refresh it one more time.
And like we showed actually on the detail slider, when you load the source, you can actually do that after you've downloaded the source as well. If you wanted the Open Topo Map maybe to be slightly larger labels, if you just go to the layer options, there's also a similar slider.
Yeah, you can do that right in here. Unfortunately, not something we have time to do today. So we give you a quick snapshot of some of the cool tools. Others on my list to showcase land cover. I mentioned that one. The topo maps. Premium sources worth noting as well. We mentioned it before. The ability to um, uh, uh, basically set up a subscription to one of these commercial sources. Global Mapper then provides a direct access to whatever you have subscribed to. Now, a few bullets I want to cover before we wrap up for the day, just kind of, again, some of the logistical considerations. We've talked about offline data. This data is not going to be saved for offline use automatically. If I disconnect, if I take my laptop into the field, I no longer have a connection, I'm not going to have access to this data. So the simple action that you'll need to follow if you want to have this available offline is to export. And that's a simple process. You run your export as a raster layer. In this case, I run that raster. We've had a few questions on that specifically. Can I export raster versions of your OpenStreetMap? Absolutely. I do it all the time. This is where you would go through that process. People often ask for a recommendation for a format. Well, Global Mapper supports over 300 formats of data, so it really doesn't matter. But I would recommend, if you're looking for something, some specific combination of image quality and efficient compression, JPEG 2000 is a good example, or a good format to choose. That data then is stored locally as a file. You're no longer depending on the online service. That is definitely a recommendation if you anticipate working offline, or indeed you don't have a reliable internet connection, running through that export process. The list, as we mentioned in Global Mapper, is updated dynamically. As Kat and I were preparing for this presentation, we noticed a few anomalies in there. We cleaned those up in real time. Some of the data categories were misplaced. So that is something we update on an ongoing basis. You can become part of that. And we've said this before. Please let us know. I'm going to show you in a few seconds here our email address. If you're aware of a service that you use in your local jurisdictional area, let us know. And we've got the categories. We'll slot it into the appropriate category. Maybe we'll create a whole new country category if you've got data for your country. We want to make sure we're staying current, and you folks out there using this tool are the ones who can provide us with that information. I also want to mention, before we wrap up, Global Mapper Mobile. Global Mapper Mobile is our mobile application, and the reason I'm bringing it up in this context is because I think it was last year, Kat, did we introduce Global Mapper Pro last year? I believe it was 2020, sometime over last calendar year. We introduced a Pro version, which includes many of the streaming services you have here, including the ability to download directly to your phone. So if you do anticipate working in a mobile environment, you definitely have that option to access many of these data sets we have in the desktop version, but in a mobile context, again, with that option to capture those and save them locally on your device. Lots of questions came in at the end. We will be following up with you directly. Any questions we did not have a chance to answer, we will get to those, and we'll be responding to those offline. We'll also take the questions that you've asked and publish a blog, so you'll see all those questions and the answers. That will hopefully be linked at the bottom of the video if you're looking at that at a later date. A couple of email addresses on the screen here. If you're interested in Global Mapper, taking a look at this, you can download a trial, by the way. Go to the website. You can download a trial version and certainly access all of the services that we showed you today, and indeed add your own as well. If you want to talk to somebody about licensing, shoot an email to orders@bluemarblegeo.com, and we can tell you about our network license options, maybe a dongle license if you do anticipate working remotely. geohelp@bluemarblegeo.com. If you have questions about any of the content we covered today, if you have sources of data that you want to share with us, that's how you can tell us. Or indeed, if you have any questions about anything related to Global Mapper, you can certainly use that geohelp@bluemarblegeo.com email. So, Katrina, thank you for sharing your expertise about the online data and the custom sources. Appreciate your help today.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Excellent. And folks, we will be back next month to talk a little bit about working with raster data. So we will hopefully see you then. Bye.